Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. Comment on where you're watching from, because what we're going to explore today transcends generations and borders. There's a silence that echoes through the mountains of West Virginia, a secret so deep it's been erased from official records, banished from family conversations, and whispered only when night falls over the misty valleys. This is the story of the Crowe family, a name that should be in the history books, but has been deliberately forgotten. It is 1862, in the midst of the American Civil War. While the country bled on distant battlefields, a different tragedy unfolded in the isolated mountains of Greenbrier County. The Appalachian Mountains had always been a place apart, where time seemed to move differently. Entire families lived separated by miles of steep trails, where the fog descended so thickly that you could get lost just a few feet from your own door. It was a world of self-sufficiency, where federal law rarely reached and communities created their own rules. The Crowe family had been established in that region for over 30 years. They weren't wealthy, but they owned substantial land along the Greenbrier River Valley, a fertile stretch surrounded by dense oak and pine forests. The Crowe property was located in an area known locally as Hollow Creek, a name that still appears on old maps, though few know what truly happened there. The main house was a robust two-story wood and stone structure, with a deep cellar carved into the mountain rock. Scattered around it were barns, a small forge and cabins for seasonal workers. Silas Crowe was the patriarch, a man of imposing stature, almost 2 meters tall, with dark hair always combed back and disturbing grey eyes that seemed to pierce through people. At 48 years old in 1862, Silas commanded not only his family, but wielded considerable influence over the entire valley community. He had built his modest fortune through the lumber trade and, according to some accounts of the time, high-interest loans to struggling farmers. He was not loved, but he was respected out of fear. Neighbors described his presence as oppressive, a shadow that extended far beyond his physical figure. Silas's wife, Margaret Crowe, was a woman of unknown origin. County records show she appeared in the area around 1830, but no document prior to that mentions her maiden name or place of origin. She was tall, thin, with almost white blonde hair that she always kept braided. Margaret spoke little, and when she did, her voice had an accent that no one could accurately identify. Some said it was European, perhaps German or Dutch. Others whispered that she came from even more distant places. What everyone agreed on was that there was something strange about her eyes, an intensity that made people look away. The couple had 4 living children in 1862. The eldest, Nathaniel, was 27 years old and had taken over much of the management of the land. He was a younger replica of his father, with the same intimidating height and the same grey eyes. Next came Eliza, 24, who lived reclusively on the property and was rarely seen in town. Neighbors commented that she spent entire days locked on the second floor of the house, and that sometimes a strange singing could be heard coming from that direction at dusk. The 2 youngest sons, Thomas and Samuel, were 21 and 19 years old respectively. Both helped with the family business, but were described as particularly cruel to the workers and animals. The Civil War had created a strange atmosphere in Greenbrier County. West Virginia had just seceded from Virginia to remain in the Union, but loyalties in the region were deeply divided. Families were fragmented, neighbors became enemies, and the law had practically ceased to exist. Deserters from both sides roamed the mountains, as did bandits who took advantage of the chaos to plunder isolated properties. It was in this context of violence and anarchy that the Crowe family's story began to take its dark turn. In the summer of 1862, strange rumors began circulating about the property in Hollow Creek. Workers hired for the harvest were disappearing without warning. Initially, this didn't cause much alarm. After all, it was wartime, and men were abandoning jobs to enlist or evade conscription. But there was something different about these disappearances. The workers' personal belongings remained in the cabins. Tools were left abandoned in the middle of tasks, and in some cases, meals were still on the tables, as if the people had simply evaporated into thin air. A traveling salesman named Josiah Webb made a disturbing entry in his personal diary, now preserved in the Greenbrier County Historical Archives. In August 1862, he wrote about a visit to the Crowe property to sell fabrics and hardware. Webb described an atmosphere of palpable fear among the few workers who still remained on the premises. One man, whom he did not name, reportedly whispered that people would enter the basement of the main house and never be seen again. Another spoke of strange sounds coming from underground at night, such as rhythmic thumping and muffled moans. What makes Webb's testimony particularly valuable is that he disappeared 3 days after making that note. His horse and cart were found abandoned on a road 8 kilometers from the Crowe property, with all the goods intact. Webb was never seen again. His wife, who lived in Lewisburg, contacted the local authorities, but the investigation was minimal. The county sheriff at the time, a man named Clayton Marsh, visited the Crowe property and declared that he found nothing suspicious. Curiously, later bank records would show that Marsh received a substantial payment from Silas Crowe a few days after closing the investigation. As the autumn of 1862 approached, the characteristic Appalachian fog began to envelop Hollow Creek with greater frequency and intensity. Residents of neighboring farms reported that the Crowe property seemed perpetually shrouded in mist, even on clear days when the rest of the valley was in full sun. This climatic anomaly fueled old superstitions that already circulated about the family. It was said that Margaret Crowe practiced dark arts, that Silas had made a pact deep in the forest, and that the children carried an invisible mark that attracted misfortune. We know today, through fragments of correspondence and diaries that have survived, that something terrible was indeed happening on that isolated property. But what exactly, and why it was so systematically erased from official records, is a story that defies comprehension and forces us to question what really happens when civilization recedes and humanity's darkest instincts find fertile ground in the shadows of the mountains. If you're enjoying this investigation, please like and subscribe to the channel. In the comments, tell me, do you believe there are stories that were intentionally erased from books? Let's continue unearthing the secrets of the Crowe family. The arrival of winter brought with it an unnatural silence to Hollow Creek. The Appalachian Mountains normally echoed with the sounds of wildlife, the howl of wolves, the hoot of owls, the rustling of deer in the dry leaves. But that December, residents of neighboring farms noticed that the animals seemed to completely avoid the area around the Crowe property. It was as if an invisible border had been drawn, beyond which no creature dared to cross. We need to understand the social context of that time, to comprehend how events could have unfolded without intervention. The Civil War had destroyed any semblance of civil order in the region. Greenbrier County was technically under Union control, but Confederate forces made regular incursions through the mountains. The area changed hands repeatedly between the fall and winter of that year. There was no functioning government, the courts were closed, and the only sheriff was Clayton Marsh, who, as we have already mentioned, was under the financial influence of Silas Crowe. During this period, a woman named Sarah Pemberton began documenting disturbing observations in letters to her sister in Richmond, Virginia. Sarah was the wife of a doctor who served families scattered throughout the mountains, and her correspondence was preserved by the family and eventually donated to the West Virginia Historical Society decades later. In these letters, Sarah described the growing unease in the community regarding the Crowes. In one of her midwinter letters, Sarah wrote about a specific incident. Her husband, Dr. Henry Pemberton, had been called to attend to an injured worker on the Crowe property. When he arrived, he was met by Nathaniel, the eldest son, who took him not to the workers' huts, but to a separate structure at the back of the property. Sarah described this place as a low, elongated, windowless stone building that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, like a scar in the ground. Dr. Pemberton never spoke openly about what he saw inside that facility, but Sarah reported that her husband returned home deeply disturbed. He reportedly murmured something about inhumane conditions, and people kept in circumstances that defied decency, but refused to elaborate. When Sarah suggested he report his observations to the authorities, Henry replied that there were no authorities to report to, and that speaking openly about the Crowes would be signing his own death warrant. In the following weeks, Dr. Pemberton developed a tremor in his hands and began drinking heavily, something completely out of character for him. Another fascinating document from this period is the Register Book of the Frankfort Baptist Church, a small congregation located a few miles from Hollow Creek. Reverend Amos Blackwell kept meticulous notes on his parish, and these notes reveal a troubling pattern. During that autumn and winter, several families who had previously attended church services simply stopped showing up. Blackwell made pastoral visits to these families and recorded that they had all suddenly moved out of the area, leaving behind homes, crops, and in some cases even livestock. What made it even stranger was that none of these families had mentioned plans to leave. There were no farewells, No property sales, no letters explaining their destination. The houses simply stood empty. Blackwell noted his suspicion that an evil force was operating in the valley, driving out the righteous and leaving only those who made deals with darkness. He specifically mentioned that all the abandoned properties were on land bordering the Crowe property or located along the routes leading to it. We need to talk about the unique geography of that region to understand how the Crowes managed to operate with such impunity. Hollow Creek was located at the end of a narrow valley surrounded by steep mountains. There were only 2 roads leading there, both difficult to navigate even in good weather. During the winter, snow could completely block access for weeks. The property itself covered hundreds of hectares, most of it covered by dense forest. It was an isolated kingdom, a fiefdom where Silas Crowe was the absolute lord and where witnesses were rare and easily silenced. With the arrival of the new year, an incident occurred that finally began to break the silence. A group of Union soldiers, deserters who roamed the mountains looting isolated farms, decided to attack the Crowe property. They assumed that a wealthy family in such a remote area would be an easy target. The soldiers arrived at night, armed with rifles and revolvers, and demanded entry into the main house. What happened in the following hours remains partially obscure, but we know the outcome through a military report filed months later. Only one of the soldiers survived. He was found days later, wandering deliriously in the woods, miles away from Hollow Creek. When he finally regained consciousness at the military hospital in Lewisburg, the man, identified as Private Jacob Hurley of the Ohio Infantry Regiment, gave testimony that his superiors dismissed as a result of mental trauma and exposure to the cold. Hurley insisted that the Crowes did not resist the attack, but rather invited them inside. Once inside, the doors were locked, and the soldiers found themselves trapped. According to Hurley, they were taken to the basement, a much larger and more elaborate structure than would be expected in a typical farmhouse. He described corridors carved into the rock, multiple rooms lit by torches, and an atmosphere of dampness and decay. It was then that they saw other people, confined in cramped spaces, people whom Hurley described as alive but devoid of will, as if their souls had been sucked out, leaving only empty shells. Hurley claimed he managed to escape only because he knew lock-picking techniques, having been a thief before enlisting, and because the Crowes were occupied with their companions. The military report concluded that Hurley had suffered a mental breakdown, possibly aggravated by alcohol or hallucinogenic substance use. No investigation was conducted. The army had more pressing problems than investigating the fantasies of a traumatized deserter. Hurley was declared unfit for service and discharged. He spent the following years interned in a veterans' home in Pennsylvania, where he eventually died. Among his personal belongings, found after his death, was a diary in which he had repeatedly written the same phrase on every page, hundreds of times: "They keep souls in the basement. They keep souls in the basement." Spring brought a change in the region's political climate. Union forces established a firmer grip on West Virginia and began efforts to restore some form of civilian government. A new sheriff was appointed for Greenbrier County, a man named Robert Thatcher, a war veteran with no prior connections to the local families and a reputation for being incorruptible. This appointment would mark the beginning of the end for the Crowes, though no one knew it yet. Thatcher began his work investigating the missing persons cases that had accumulated during the years of chaos. He compiled a list with dozens of names of individuals who had disappeared in Greenbrier County since the beginning of the war, and noted that most of these cases had some connection, however tenuous, to the Crowe property. Some were workers who had been employed there. Others were travelers whose last known location was on the roads leading to Hollow Creek. Some were neighbors who had had property disputes with Silas Crowe. Thatcher was methodical and patient. He didn't rush. He spent months interviewing people, examining property records, studying maps of the region. He visited the Crowe estate several times during the summer, always under official but innocuous pretexts, always observing, always asking casual questions. Silas Crowe received these visits with cold courtesy, never refusing cooperation, but also never volunteering information. It was a game of cat and mouse, where both sides knew what was really happening, but neither could make a direct move without unpredictable consequences. While Thatcher conducted her quiet investigation, life on the Crowe estate continued its grim routine. Margaret was seen less and less, remaining confined to the second floor of the main house. Locals passing by the road near the property reported seeing her silhouette at her bedroom window, motionless for hours, staring blankly at the surrounding mountains. Eliza, the daughter, became even more reclusive, and rumors circulated that she had developed a strange obsession, spending her days drawing incomprehensible symbols on her bedroom walls. The sons, Nathaniel, Thomas, and Samuel, continued to run the family business with brutal efficiency. They expanded the lumber operations, bought land from desperate neighbors, and consolidated their economic power in the region. But there was something different about their behavior after the incident with the deserting soldiers. They became more cautious, less visible in public, as if they knew that the time of total impunity was coming to an end. Thatcher's shadow loomed over them, and even the Crowes, with all their arrogance, were beginning to feel the weight of watchful eyes. Summer brought with it an unusual drought to the Appalachian Mountains. The streams that normally flowed abundantly through the valley began to dry up, revealing rocky riverbeds that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. It was during this period of drought that a macabre discovery would come to light, not through official investigation, but by accident of nature. A farmer named Edmund Walsh, whose property was approximately 5 kilometers downstream from the Crowe's land, noticed something strange in his well. The water, which had always been crystal clear, began to emit a disturbing odor. Walsh descended to the bottom of the well to investigate and discovered that the water table had dropped so low that it now exposed a crack in the rock, a natural opening that seemed to connect to a system of underground caves. From within this crack came the smell, and something even more disturbing. Walsh swore he heard sounds coming from the depths, distant echoes that sounded almost human. Walsh reported his discovery to Robert Thatcher, who immediately recognized its potential significance. The geology of the region was known for its extensive networks of limestone caves, many of which were still unmapped. If the Crowe property was connected to this subterranean system, it could explain a great deal. It could explain how people disappeared without a trace. It could explain reports of sounds coming from underground. It could explain why surface searches of the property never revealed anything suspicious. Thatcher began consulting old geological maps and interviewing elderly residents who knew the caves in the area. One man in particular, a retired hunter named Virgil Mason, provided valuable information. Mason had explored many of the local caves in his youth and knew the underground network better than anyone. He revealed that there was a known cave entrance on the Crowe property, a wide opening hidden behind a curtain of vines and dense vegetation, located on the north side of the property, near the edge of the forest. Even more intriguing, Mason mentioned that this cave had a bad reputation among the older inhabitants of the region. Previous generations had considered the place cursed, a place where strange things happened even before the Crowe family settled there. There were stories of native peoples who avoided that specific area, calling it a place where restless spirits dwelt. Mason confessed that in all his explorations, this was a cave he had never fully entered, always feeling an oppressive presence that made him recoil. Armed with this information, Thatcher needed a legal pretext to conduct a thorough search of the Crowe property. He couldn't simply raid it based on rumors and suspicions. He needed concrete evidence or a formal complaint. The opportunity arose from an unexpected source, a woman who arrived in Lewisburg at the end of that summer, thin with tattered clothes and eyes that had seen unspeakable horrors. Her name was Rebecca Hartley, and she had been the wife of one of the workers who had disappeared on the Crowe property months earlier. Rebecca claimed to have gone to Hollow Creek looking for her husband and, by asking persistent questions, ended up being captured by the family. What she described to Thatcher in the following weeks would form the most detailed and disturbing testimony about the Crowe operations up to that point. According to Rebecca, she was kept in one of the underground compartments, not exactly in the main house, but in a network of rooms excavated partly in the natural rock and partly constructed of stone and wood. These chambers were accessed through multiple entrances, some inside the house, others in external buildings, and at least one through the natural cave that Mason had mentioned. The system was labyrinthine, deliberately designed to disorient anyone who was taken there. Rebecca described seeing other people in those underground spaces, perhaps a dozen or more, in varying states of despair. Some appeared to have been kept there for a long time, their clothes in tatters, their bodies weakened. She spoke of a strange hierarchy among the captives, where some seemed to have accepted their situation and even assisted the Crowes in exchange for less harsh treatment. Others resisted and were kept in worse conditions, in smaller, deeper chambers. The most disturbing aspect of Rebecca's account was the description of the apparent purpose of that system. It wasn't simply a matter of keeping prisoners. There was something more elaborate going on. Rebecca spoke of strange rituals conducted by Margaret Crowe, ceremonies that took place in a larger central chamber where symbols had been painted on the stone walls. She described how Margaret recited words in a language Rebecca didn't recognize, while Silas and the children stood in a circle around her. Rebecca managed to escape during a night of intense storm when thunder and rain masked the sounds of her flight. She found one of the secondary exits leading to the forest, a narrow passage that required crawling through natural tunnels for a considerable distance. It took her days to find her way back to civilization, guiding herself by the stars when possible, and surviving on water from streams and roots she managed to dig up. Rebecca's testimony was exactly what Thatcher needed, but it also presented significant challenges. The woman was clearly traumatized, and any competent lawyer could question the reliability of her claims. Furthermore, the Crowes had considerable resources and political connections, even if weakened by the war. Thatcher knew she would need more than a witness's word to secure a conviction. She would need physical evidence, bodies, irrefutable proof. While Thatcher planned her strategy, events on the Crowe estate began to take an even darker turn. The few workers who remained on the farm noticed changes in the family's behavior. Silas, normally controlled and calculating, had become erratic and explosive. He was seen shouting alone in the fields, cursing the sky and the neighbors. Margaret was no longer seen, not even at the windows. Rumors circulated that she had become seriously ill, or perhaps completely insane. Nathaniel took on more responsibilities, but seemed to carry an invisible weight. Witnesses who saw him in the city described a man who aged rapidly, with prematurely graying hair and a constantly vigilant expression, as if he expected to be attacked at any moment. Thomas and Samuel became even more isolated, seen only occasionally and always armed, always suspicious. Eliza, the daughter, emerged from her self-imposed confinement in a dramatic way. She began appearing in the fields at night, walking barefoot across the property, sometimes singing softly, sometimes just standing motionless for hours, gazing at the mountains. Workers reported that she seemed to be in some kind of trance, not responding when called, as if she were only physically present while her mind wandered to distant and dark places. The tension in the region was palpable. Residents locked their doors more carefully. Travelers avoided the roads near Hollow Creek, preferring to take long detours through less direct routes. Stories spread from village to village, each retelling adding new macabre details, transforming the Crowes into almost mythical figures of terror. Some began to call them the Cursed Family, a title that carried supernatural weight beyond the very real crimes they had committed. Robert Thatcher knew he was racing against time. If the Crowes suspected that imminent legal action was approaching, they could destroy evidence, silence witnesses permanently, or simply disappear into the vastness of the Appalachian Mountains. He needed to act, but he needed to act decisively and forcefully enough to leave no room for error. What he didn't yet know was that the Crowes themselves were preparing for something, a final event that would put a dramatic end to their horror story. Autumn arrived with unusual intensity that year. The leaves on the trees took on such deep shades of red that they seemed almost black under the dim light filtering through the persistent clouds. The fog returned to Hollow Creek with renewed vigor, enveloping the Crowe property in a gray blanket that seemed never to completely dissipate even under the midday sun. It was during this period that Thatcher finally managed to gather what he needed to act. Through Rebecca Hartley, he located two other people who had managed to escape the Crowe estate at different times over the years. One was a man named Peter Donovan, who had worked as a lumberjack on the property and witnessed things that had haunted him ever since. The other was a young woman named Catherine Mills, whose brother had disappeared in Hollow Creek and who, in searching for him, had almost shared his fate. The three testimonies aligned in disturbing ways. All described the underground system, all mentioned the ceremonies conducted by Margaret, all spoke of the atmosphere of utter despair that permeated those spaces beneath the earth. Peter added details about how the Crowes selected their victims, preferring people without close family, lone travelers, or those whose disappearance could easily be attributed to the dangers of war. Catherine described seeing records kept by Nathaniel, ledgers where names were listed alongside dates, as if they were an inventory of goods. Armed with this testimony, Thatcher assembled a group of trusted men. They weren't many, perhaps 10 in all, but they were war veterans accustomed to violence and prepared for whatever they might encounter. He also secured the approval of a federal judge in Wheeling, a broad warrant authorizing a thorough search of the property and the arrest of any member of the Crowe family suspected of serious crimes. The operation was planned to take place at dawn, when the family would still be at home and less prepared for resistance. Thatcher divided her men into 3 groups. The first would approach the main house from the front, the second would cover the side exits and the outer buildings, and the third, led by Virgil Mason, would position itself at the entrance to the cave to prevent any escape through the underground system. The night before the operation, Thatcher barely slept. He reviewed the plans repeatedly, considered all possible scenarios, mentally prepared himself for what he might find. There was a part of him that hoped he was wrong, that wished the testimonies were exaggerated, that the reality would be less horrific than the descriptions suggested. But deep down, he knew the truth would be worse than anyone imagined. Dawn arrived cold and foggy. Thatcher's men gathered a few miles from Hollow Creek, checked their weapons, and received their final instructions. There was a palpable nervousness among them, not out of fear of confrontation, but because of the unknown nature of what they would face. These were men who had fought on battlefields, who had seen death up close, but something in the Crows' history touched on more primal fears, on terrors that preceded civilization. They advanced silently through the forest, using hunting trails to avoid the main roads. The fog enveloped them like a shroud, muffling sounds and distorting distances. When they finally sighted the property, everything seemed surprisingly normal. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. A few chickens scratched in the yard. There was no sign of alarm or preparation for resistance. Thatcher gave the signal, and her men moved simultaneously. The front group reached the main door and banged hard, announcing their legal authority. There was a moment of silence, then sounds of movement inside the house. The door opened, and Nathaniel Crowe appeared, dressed as if expecting visitors, completely calm, with a cold smile on his lips. He did not resist arrest, nor did he try to argue or question the warrant. He simply extended his wrists toward the handcuffs, as if this moment were inevitable, and he had been preparing for it for a long time. Thomas and Samuel were found in the barn, and their reaction was equally disconcerting. There was no surprise on their faces, only a strange resignation, almost like relief. Silas was found in his second-floor office, seated behind a large oak desk. He was motionless, gazing out the window towards the mountains. When Thatcher's men entered, he didn't turn around. He only spoke in a low voice, saying that he knew this day would come, that everything has its time to end. He also didn't resist arrest, but there was something in his eyes, a depth of knowledge or perhaps madness, that made even the bravest men instinctively recoil. Margaret was found in her room, and what the men saw there would haunt them for years. The room was covered in symbols drawn on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Some were recognizable from ancient European traditions. Others seemed like creations of a mind that had delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge. Margaret lay on the bed, conscious but unresponsive, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, murmuring inaudible words in her strange language. Eliza was nowhere to be found. A thorough search of the house revealed no trace of her. Her room was empty, the bed made, no personal belongings remaining. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist, evaporating like the morning mist. This absence would create a secondary mystery that would never be fully resolved. With the family imprisoned, Thatcher turned her attention to the true objective of the operation, to find evidence of the crimes and, if possible, survivors. The group of men assigned to explore the underground system prepared themselves with flashlights, ropes, and forced courage. The entrance through the basement of the main house revealed stone stairs descending at a steep angle into the depths. What they found in the following hours defied adequate description. The corridors were extensive, more elaborate than any testimony had suggested. Some sections were natural caves that the Crows had adapted. Others were entirely constructed of stone and wood, a project that would have taken years to complete. On the walls, more symbols, some painted, others engraved directly into the rock. They found the chambers where people had been kept. There were chains fixed to the walls, evidence of prolonged occupation, abandoned personal belongings. In a larger room which seemed to serve as the center of the ceremonies Rebecca had described, they found a stone altar, surrounded by concentric circles of symbols. The air there was heavy, laden with an odor of decay and something else, something the men couldn't identify but which made their skin crawl. The most disturbing thing was what they found in the deepest chambers, physical evidence of the fates of many of the missing. I won't describe the details here, both out of respect for the dead and because of the nature of what was discovered. Suffice it to say that it confirmed Thatcher's worst fears and provided irrefutable proof of the Crowe family's crimes. Surprisingly, they also found survivors. 4 people were still alive, kept in the most deplorable conditions imaginable, so weak they could barely speak, so traumatized that it would take them months to begin to recover any semblance of normality. These people were immediately removed and taken for medical care in Lewisburg. The complete exploration of the underground system took 3 days. With each new chamber discovered, the magnitude of the Crowe family's crimes became clearer. This had not been the work of impulse or momentary madness. It was systematic, planned, executed with precision over years. Nathaniel's records found in an underground office confirmed this. He had meticulously documented everything. Dates, names, details that revealed an organized mind, conducting atrocities with the same efficiency with which someone would run a business. When news of the operation and the findings spread throughout the region, the reaction was a mixture of horror, validation for those who had always suspected, and a collective desire for swift justice. Crowds began to gather in Lewisburg, demanding that the Crowes face immediate punishment. Thatcher had to position guards around the temporary prison to prevent lynching attempts. The Crowe family's story had finally been brought to light, but many questions remained unanswered. Why had they done this? What was the real purpose behind those ceremonies? Where had Eliza disappeared to? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, for exactly how long had this been going on? The days following the Crowe family's arrest were marked by an atmosphere of collective disbelief. As details of the investigation leaked into the community, even those who had suspected the Crowes for years found themselves confronted with a reality that surpassed their worst imaginings. Greenbrier County, already scarred by war, now bore an even deeper wound, one that touched upon something more primal and disturbing than any political conflict. Thatcher established a full-scale operation on the Hollow Creek property. Properly documenting what they had found proved to be a monumental task. He brought in a records officer from Wheeling, a man named Augustus Finch, whose job was to meticulously catalogue every piece of evidence, every document, every detail of the underground system. Finch was known for his almost obsessive meticulousness, but even he was visibly shaken by what he witnessed. Nathaniel Crowe's records proved particularly revealing. They dated back more than a decade, suggesting that the family's activities had begun well before the war, perhaps as early as the middle of the previous decade. The earliest records were vague, more cryptic notes than clear descriptions, but over time they became more detailed, more confident, as if Nathaniel gradually abandoned any pretense of discretion. What emerged from these documents was a portrait of a family that believed it was engaged in something beyond the limits of conventional morality. There were references to ancient knowledge, to traditions that Margaret supposedly brought from her mysterious origins, to practices that promised power and influence through means that defied rational understanding. Nathaniel wrote about tests, about attempts to reach altered states of consciousness, about the search for something he simply called transcendence. Margaret Crowe remained in a catatonic state in prison. A doctor was brought in to assess her and declared that she appeared to be in some kind of self-induced trance, conscious but completely disconnected from the outside world. She did not eat, did not drink, unless forced, and continued to murmur in her incomprehensible language. The doctor confessed he had never seen anything like it in his entire career. Silas, on the other hand, spoke freely, but his words made little sense. He discoursed on historical cycles, on how civilizations rose and fell, on the true hidden meaning behind the rituals they practiced. When questioned about specific victims, he responded as if he were discussing philosophical abstractions, not real human lives. There was a fundamental disconnect in his mind between the actions he had committed and any sense of moral responsibility. Nathaniel was the most dangerous of the prisoners, precisely because he was the most lucid. He fully understood what he had done, showed no remorse, but neither did he glorify his actions. When Thatcher interrogated him, Nathaniel spoke calmly about how he had grown up in a family that saw the world differently, how from a young age he had been educated by Margaret in traditions that she insisted were older than America itself, deeper than any modern religion. Thomas and Samuel were different. They seemed to have been followers rather than active participants in the family's ideology. Without Silas and Nathaniel to guide them, they quickly crumbled psychologically. Thomas developed a constant tremor and began having violent nightmares. Samuel simply withdrew into total silence, refusing to speak to anyone. spending days staring blankly at the walls of his cell. Meanwhile, the search for Eliza continued. Search parties scoured the property and surrounding areas, following any possible lead. The initial theory was that she had fled to the mountains, perhaps knowing that the family's arrest was imminent. But as the days passed without any sign of her, darker theories began to circulate. Some suggested that Eliza had entered the cave system and become lost in the unexplored depths. The caves in the region were vast, with tunnels stretching for miles, some so narrow that a person could barely pass through, others opening into cathedral-like chambers of absolute darkness. If she had entered there without adequate light or knowledge of the passages, her chances of survival were minimal. Others speculated that Eliza hadn't run away, but rather completed some kind of final ritual. This theory gained traction from notes found in her room, fragments of writing that suggested a growing obsession with ideas of transformation and transcendence. There were drawings showing human figures dissolving into abstract patterns, words written repeatedly until they lost any apparent meaning. A group of experienced explorers was recruited to map the cave system more thoroughly. Led by Virgil Mason, they spent weeks deep underground, marking passages, documenting chambers, searching for any sign of Eliza or other possible victims. What they found was a natural labyrinth of impressive complexity, with sections that had clearly been modified by the Crowes over the years. In one of the deepest chambers, accessible only through a series of narrow and treacherous passages, the explorers found something that added another layer of mystery to the story. The walls of this chamber were covered with ancient paintings, not made by the Crowes, but clearly of much older origin. The images were abstract, yet unsettling, stylized figures in poses that suggested rituals or ceremonies, symbols that did not correspond to any known tradition. Virgil Mason, who knew stories told by the native peoples of the region, recognized some of the images. He explained that ancient tribes had considered certain caves as sacred or cursed places, portals to other worlds or dwellings of spirits. This particular cave was one that local legends mentioned as particularly dangerous, a place where the boundary between the physical world and something beyond became blurred. The discovery raised a disturbing question. Had the Crowes chosen that location specifically because of these ancient associations? Had Margaret, with her knowledge of obscure traditions, known about the history of the cave and deliberately established the family there? This would suggest a level of planning that went back decades, a long-term strategy that began long before any crime was committed. Augustus Finch spent hours in that deep chamber, meticulously copying the ancient symbols and comparing them to those the Crowes had painted in their own chambers. There were unsettling similarities, but also significant differences, as if the Crowes had attempted to replicate or adapt something they didn't fully understand. Finch speculated that Margaret may have had partial knowledge of ancient traditions and had tried to reconstruct them, possibly making mistakes or distortions in the process. The survivors rescued from captivity slowly began to regain their strength and ability to communicate. Their stories, when they were finally able to tell them, added horrific but important details to the understanding of what had happened. A man named William Chase, who had been held captive for almost a year, described how the Crowes seemed to be experimenting, testing different methods and observing results as if conducting some kind of perverse study. Chase spoke of how Margaret conducted ceremonies at regular intervals, always on the new moon, always in the central chamber with the stone altar. She recited invocations in her strange language, burned herbs that produced nauseatingly smelly smoke, and forced the captives to participate in ways Chase preferred not to detail. The apparent purpose of these ceremonies never became clear to him, but he noted that after each one, Margaret seemed energized while the captives grew increasingly weak. Another survivor, a woman named Hannah Porter, provided insights into the dynamics within the Crowe family. She had been kept in one of the upper chambers, closer to the main house, and occasionally overheard conversations between family members. Hannah described growing tensions, especially between Silas and Nathaniel, about the direction their activities should take. Silas apparently wanted to expand, to become more ambitious, while Nathaniel argued for more caution. According to Hannah, Eliza was a constant but enigmatic presence. She visited the captives sometimes, but didn't speak. She only observed, studied, as if trying to understand something. Hannah remembered one occasion when Eliza stood before her cell for hours, completely motionless, just staring, and Hannah had the disturbing impression that Eliza was somehow absent, that her body was there but her consciousness was somewhere else entirely. As more information emerged, The community struggled to process the magnitude of what had happened in their midst. How could an entire family be involved in something so horrific? How had no one noticed or acted sooner? These questions fueled collective guilt and a search for scapegoats. Former Sheriff Clayton Marsh was publicly confronted, though he died of a heart attack, before he could be formally questioned about his role in covering up for the Crowes. As autumn turned into winter, preparations for the Crowe family trial became the central focus of all of Greenbrier County and beyond. News of the case had spread rapidly through neighboring states, attracting the attention of journalists, curious onlookers, and those who simply couldn't believe such horrors could occur on American soil. Lewisburg, normally a quiet town, found itself flooded with visitors, transforming its few inns into overcrowded places where conversations about the Crowes dominated every table and every corner. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a man named Cornelius Bradford, a veteran Richmond lawyer who had been specially requested due to the complexity and seriousness of the accusations. Bradford was known for his meticulousness and his ability to present complicated cases in a way that ordinary juries could understand. He arrived in Lewisburg in early November and immediately met with Thatcher to review all the evidence collected. Bradford spent weeks immersed in documents, testimonies, and physical descriptions of the underground system. He visited the Hollow Creek property personally, descended into the deep chambers, and saw with his own eyes what had been created there. When he emerged, he was visibly pale and confessed to Thatcher that in decades of his career, he had never encountered anything that touched so deeply on his convictions about human nature. The defense of the Crowes presented its own unique challenges. Initially, no local lawyer was willing to represent them, both out of personal aversion and fear of social repercussions. Eventually, a Charleston lawyer named Edmund Price accepted the case, not out of sympathy for the accused, but out of a firm belief in every accused person's right to a proper defense. Price was a man of rigid principles, lean and austere, with a reputation for being brilliant but difficult. Price quickly realized that a traditional defense would be impossible. The physical evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies too consistent, the documentation left by Nathaniel practically a written confession. His only viable strategy would be to argue insanity, to try to demonstrate that the Crowe family suffered from collective delusions so profound that they could not be held legally responsible for their actions. To build this argument, Price brought in experts from places as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, doctors specializing in mental illness, scholars of aberrant human behavior, even a professor of comparative religions who could testify about the nature of the rituals Margaret conducted. These experts spent hours interviewing each member of the Crowe family, trying to construct psychological profiles that would explain the inexplicable. Dr. Ambrose Whitfield, a renowned alienist from Boston, spent 3 days examining Margaret. She remained in her catatonic state, but Whitfield observed patterns in her murmurs, tried to identify the language she spoke, and studied her occasional movements. He concluded that Margaret was in a psychological state he had never documented before, something that seemed to transcend the known categories of madness. In his report, he speculated that she had induced herself into some kind of permanent dissociative state, perhaps as a mechanism to escape the reality of what she had done. Silas was diagnosed with what Whitfield called messianic megalomania, an unwavering conviction that he was destined to achieve something great through means that ordinary society could not comprehend. Silas genuinely believed that his actions had a higher purpose, that he was accessing fundamental truths about human existence. There was no regret because in his distorted mind, there was nothing to regret. Nathaniel presented the most complex case. He was clearly sane in the conventional sense, capable of logical reasoning, of planning and executing complex actions, of understanding consequences. But there was a coldness in his psyche, a complete absence of empathy that Whitfield found deeply disturbing. Nathaniel saw other people as objects, tools to achieve specific ends. He had been shaped since childhood by Margaret and Silas, raised in a worldview so fundamentally deviant that conventional morality simply did not exist in his mental universe. Thomas and Samuel were diagnosed as dependent personalities who had been completely dominated by family influence. Without the structure provided by Silas and Nathaniel, they disintegrated. Whitfield believed that they had participated in the crimes not out of their own conviction, but out of an inability to resist or even conceive of resistance to family authority. While legal preparations progressed, the search for Eliza, finally yielded results, though not in the way anyone expected. A group of hunters found evidence of her presence in an abandoned cabin deep in the mountains, nearly 20 kilometers from Hollow Creek. The cabin was empty when they arrived, but there were clear signs of recent occupation: still warm ashes in the fireplace, partially consumed provisions, and on the walls, more symbols, more drawings. The symbols in this cabin were different from those found on the Crowe property. They were more elaborate, more complex, suggesting an evolution or refinement of the ideas Margaret had introduced. There were also writings, pages and pages of text in multiple languages, some recognizable as Latin and ancient Greek, others completely incomprehensible. The content dealt with transformation, transcending physical limitations and reaching states of existence beyond the human. Thatcher organized an intensive search of the area around the cabin. Teams scoured miles of forest, followed old trails, explored hidden ravines and valleys. But Eliza seemed to have vanished like smoke. Some theorized that she had perished in the forest, a victim of the cold or predators. Others believed she had continued deeper into the mountains, perhaps crossing into Kentucky or Tennessee, where she could start a new life without being recognized. There were also those who whispered darker theories: that Eliza had completed some final ritual in that cabin, that the symbols on the walls were records of a process she had performed on herself, that her disappearance was not an escape, but a transformation into something no longer fully human. These speculations were dismissed by rational people as superstition, but the absence of any trace of her beyond that cabin left room for disturbed imaginations to fill the voids. The trial was scheduled for early December, to be held in the county court in Lewisburg. The appointed judge was Horatio Blackburn, a man of nearly 70 years with a reputation for severity, but also for scrupulous justice. Blackburn had reluctantly agreed to preside over the case, understanding its historical importance, but also the weight he would carry for the rest of his life. The court had to be expanded to accommodate the public interest. Temporary bleachers were built, and even then there were far more people wanting to watch than there was space available. Blackburn established strict rules. No emotional displays would be tolerated. Any disturbance would result in immediate expulsion. He wanted the proceedings to be conducted with dignity, not to become a circus show. In the days leading up to the trial, the tension in Lewisburg was palpable. Vigilante groups formed spontaneously, discussing summary justice. Thatcher had to double the guards around the prison and establish constant patrols on the streets. There was a feeling that something needed to be settled definitively, that the trial represented not only justice for individual victims, but a necessary cleansing for the entire community. The press across the country sent correspondence. Newspapers in cities as far away as New York and Chicago published speculative articles about the case. Some tried to rationalize it as a symptom of the brutalization caused by the war, others as an example of how the frontier still harbored wild elements that civilization had not completely tamed. There were also those who saw in the Crowe case something more disturbing, a suggestion that beneath the surface of polite society there were dark currents that could emerge at any moment. The families of the identified victims began arriving in Lewisburg from different parts of West Virginia and neighboring states. Many had spent years not knowing the fate of their loved ones, living with hope slowly dwindling into despair. Now they had answers, but answers that brought more pain than relief. The recognition of personal belongings found in the underground system, the confirmation through physical evidence, all of this reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Bradford gathered these families together and carefully explained what they could expect from the trial. He was honest about the challenges they would face, about how Price would try to plead insanity, about how the process would be long and emotionally devastating. But he also promised that he would do everything in his power to ensure that justice was done, that the Crowe family's crimes were fully exposed and punished. The night before the trial began, Robert Thatcher stayed awake in his office, reviewing all the case documents one last time. He thought about all the people who had disappeared, all those who had suffered, how a place as seemingly peaceful as the Appalachian Mountains could harbor such horrors. And he thought about Eliza, still somewhere out there, carrying with her the final secrets of the Crowe family, secrets that might never be fully revealed. The dawn of the first day of the trial brought with it a heavy gray sky, laden with snow that threatened to fall at any moment. The streets of Lewisburg were already teeming with people, even before the sun had fully risen, crowds gathering around the courthouse, waiting for any opportunity to witness what promised to be one of the most significant trials in West Virginia history. Inside the courtroom, The atmosphere was one of almost unbearable tension. The jury members, 12 men from the region carefully selected for having no direct connections to the Crowe family or their victims, took their seats with somber expressions. They knew the weight they would carry, the decisions they would have to make, and how those decisions would haunt them regardless of the outcome. The Crowe family was brought in under heavy guard. Silas entered first, his handcuffs clinking softly, his posture still strangely dignified despite the circumstances. His eyes swept across the courtroom once, registering every face, every detail, before settling on some distant point, as if he were seeing through the walls to something beyond. Nathaniel followed, calm and composed, his face a mask of indifference that made it impossible to guess his thoughts. Thomas and Samuel looked like spectres of their former selves, thin and pale, moving mechanically among their guards. Margaret was the last to enter, supported by 2 men because her legs could barely hold her up. She was still in her catatonic state, her eyes open but empty, her lips constantly moving in silent murmurs. Her presence in court was a necessary legal formality, but it was clear to everyone that she was present only in the most technical sense. Judge Blackburn entered, and the court rose in respect. He was an imposing figure even in his advanced age, his deep voice cutting through the silence as he formally opened the proceedings. Blackburn had made it clear from the outset that he would conduct the trial with the utmost seriousness and that he expected absolute decorum from all present. Any violation would be dealt with to the utmost severity. Cornelius Bradford began his opening statement with a measured and controlled voice. He did not appeal to exaggerated emotions or dramatic rhetoric. Instead, he methodically laid out what the prosecution would prove, outlined the chronology of the crimes, and explained the nature of the evidence that would be presented. His approach was deliberately clinical, letting the facts speak for themselves, allowing the jury to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred without feeling manipulated. Bradford described how he would present survivor testimonies, physical documentation of the crimes, handwritten records by Nathaniel Crowe himself, and material evidence collected from the underground system. He explained that the case would not depend on speculation or assumption, but on concrete and irrefutable evidence. The Crowe family, he stated, had operated with impunity for years, but the truth had finally emerged and demanded a proper response from justice. Edmund Price rose to his opening statement with the expression of a man bearing a burden he had not chosen but had accepted on principle. He immediately acknowledged that the acts committed by the Crowe family were abominable, that the evidence was substantial, and that there would be no attempt to deny the basic facts of what had occurred. His defense, he explained, would center not on denying the acts, but on the question of mental responsibility. Price argued that the Crowe family suffered from shared delusions so profound that they had destroyed their ability to distinguish right from wrong. He described Margaret as the central figure who had introduced irrational beliefs that gradually consumed the entire family, creating an alternate reality where normally unthinkable actions seemed not only acceptable but necessary. Price promised to present testimony from medical experts that would demonstrate that the Crowes could not be considered legally sane at the time of the crimes. The first substantial testimony came from Rebecca Hartley, the woman who had escaped and whose account had initially alerted Thatcher. Rebecca took to the dais with remarkable dignity, considering the trauma she had experienced. Her voice trembled initially, but gained strength as she told her story. She described her search for her missing husband, her capture while questioning on the Crowe estate, and the days she spent in the underground chambers. Rebecca spoke of the conditions of confinement, the near-total darkness when the torches were not lit, the damp cold that penetrated the bones, the constant sounds of dripping water and distant movements that could be people or just echoes. She described the ceremonies conducted by Margaret, the atmosphere of terror that permeated everything, and how some captives eventually seemed to give up all hope or resistance altogether. During cross-examination, Price tried to suggest that Rebecca's memories might have been distorted by trauma, that in the darkness and confusion she might have misinterpreted what she had seen. But Rebecca remained firm, her details consistent, her certainty unwavering. When she stepped down from the podium, there were tears in the eyes of several jury members. Peter Donovan testified next, bringing the perspective of someone who had worked for the Crowes and gradually realized that something was deeply wrong. He described the atmosphere on the property, how workers disappeared and no one seemed to question it, how there were unspoken rules about which areas to avoid and what questions never to ask. Peter explained that he had tried to leave his job multiple times, But the Crowes always found ways to keep him there, through fabricated debts or veiled threats. Peter also testified about the night he tried to escape and was captured. He was taken to the underground system not as immediate punishment, but as a demonstration. Nathaniel guided him through the corridors, showing him the chambers, allowing him to see other captives, calmly explaining how the whole operation worked. It was a way of breaking his will, of making him understand that resistance was futile. Peter survived only because he managed to convince Nathaniel that he would be more useful working above ground, maintaining an appearance of normalcy. Catherine Mills provided another devastating testimony, focusing particularly on Eliza. Catherine had been held in one of the upper chambers for several weeks, and Eliza visited her frequently. Catherine described these visits as deeply disturbing, not because Eliza was cruel, but because she seemed to be studying the captives with a distant, scientific curiosity. Eliza asked strange questions about dreams, about fears, about what people felt when they lost hope. Catherine witnessed that Eliza seemed to be undergoing some kind of personal transformation. She sometimes spoke of transcending human limitations, of accessing states of consciousness that most people would never experience. There was a feverish quality to her words, an intensity that suggested she was approaching some kind of conclusion or revelation. When Catherine finally escaped and Eliza disappeared soon after, Catherine wasn't surprised. She had always felt that Eliza was walking towards something, some final destination she herself had chosen. The survivors' testimonies stretched over days, each adding layers of detail to the already grim picture. William Chase described Margaret's ceremonies with greater specificity, though with obvious discomfort. Hannah Porter spoke of the family dynamics she had observed, the tensions between Silas and Nathaniel, and the role of Thomas and Samuel as executors of others' wishes. Bradford then began presenting physical evidence. Items found in the underground system were brought to court, each catalogued and explained. Personal belongings of missing victims, tools used to build and maintain the chamber's documents and records. Most impactful was when Bradford presented Nathaniel's logbooks. Augustus Finch was called to testify about these records. He had spent weeks deciphering Nathaniel's handwriting, organizing the entries chronologically, correlating names with missing persons. Finch read selected excerpts aloud, his professional voice occasionally faltering when the content became particularly disturbing. The records were meticulous, detailed, written with the same precision one would use to document scientific experiments. Nathaniel had recorded not only names and dates, but observations about behavior, reactions to different conditions, and changes over time. There were notes about Margaret's ceremonies, theories about what they aimed to achieve, and assessments of successes and failures. It was the mind of someone completely detached from the humanity of the people he was writing about, seeing them purely as subjects of study. The courtroom was forced to take frequent breaks. Some jury members visibly struggled to process what they were hearing. Families of victims in the gallery wept openly. Judge Blackburn maintained strict order, but even he seemed to age visibly with each passing day, the weight of the case etching his face with new lines of worry. Price began his defense by bringing in Dr. Whitfield and other medical experts. Whitfield testified extensively about his examinations of the Crowe family, about the mental states he had diagnosed, about how collective delusions could develop in isolated families. He argued that Margaret had essentially created a private religion, a belief system so divorced from reality that those immersed in it could no longer function morally within social norms. Whitfield described documented phenomena of cults and isolated groups that developed progressively more extreme beliefs, where charismatic leadership combined with social isolation created bubbles of alternative reality. The Crowe family, he argued, was an extreme example of this phenomenon, exacerbated by individual mental predispositions and mutual reinforcement over years. But Bradford was prepared for this argument. In his cross-examination, he forced Whitfield to admit that Nathaniel demonstrated a clear capacity for logical reasoning, that he understood the consequences of his actions, and that he had taken deliberate steps to conceal crimes from the authorities. Bradford argued that awareness of illegality demonstrated an understanding of right and wrong, regardless of distorted personal beliefs. The trial entered its third week, amid a snowstorm that blanketed Lewisburg in a silent white mantle, as if nature itself were attempting to erase the scars left by the revelation of the Crowe family's crimes. The courtroom remained packed, but now there was a palpable fatigue among all those present, an emotional exhaustion caused by the continuous exposure to the dark details of the case. Bradford concluded his presentation of evidence with the testimony of Robert Thatcher, who methodically described the investigation, the discovery of the underground system, and the rescue of the survivors. Thatcher spoke with the authority of someone who had seen it all firsthand, who had descended into those depths and witnessed what the Crowe family had built there. His voice remained steady, but there was a deep melancholy in his eyes, the weight of knowledge he would carry for the rest of his life. During her testimony, Thatcher brought to light a detail that had been kept relatively discreet until that moment. In the deepest levels of the underground system, they had found a chamber that seemed different from all the others. It was larger, more elaborately decorated, and contained what could only be described as a complex altar surrounded by concentric circles of symbols engraved on the stone floor. This chamber was directly connected to the natural cave system, accessible through a narrow fissure that opened to unexplored depths. Thatcher explained that this chamber seemed to be the center of everything, the heart of the Crowe family's activities. Margaret had spent countless hours there, according to survivor accounts, sometimes remaining in the depths for entire days. The air in that chamber had a different quality, a density that Thatcher struggled to describe, as if the space itself were charged with something beyond ordinary physical comprehension. Price objected vigorously to this description, arguing that Thatcher was introducing subjective and superstitious elements that had no place in a court of law. Blackburn partially upheld the objection, instructing the jury to consider only verifiable facts about the chamber, not personal impressions of its atmosphere, but the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. The jury had heard, and their expressions showed that Thatcher's words had resonated with their own primal fears. The defense then presented its main case. Price brought a succession of witnesses who spoke about the Crowe family from different perspectives. A merchant who had dealt with Silas for years testified that, although Silas was tough in business, he had always honored his agreements and never displayed obviously irrational behavior. A distant neighbor described the family as reclusive, but not necessarily suspicious, attributing their isolated nature simply to geographical circumstances and personal preference. Price was trying to establish that the Crowe family's madness wasn't outwardly obvious, that they had managed to maintain a facade of normality precisely because their delusions were internally consistent. Insane people, he argued, aren't always manifestly insane in every area of their lives. The Crowe family had created a separate moral universe that existed parallel to normal society, allowing them to function superficially while operating under completely deviant principles in private. The high point of the defense was when Price called Nathaniel Crowe to testify in his own defense. The decision surprised many, including Bradford, who did not expect Price to risk putting one of the accused on the dash. But Price apparently believed that allowing the jury to hear directly from Nathaniel was his best chance to demonstrate the genuine nature of his delusions. Nathaniel ascended the dais with the same calm he had maintained throughout the trial. He took the oath, his voice clear and firm, his eyes meeting directly with Judge Blackburn's without hesitation. Price guided him through a series of carefully crafted questions, beginning with his childhood, his upbringing under Margaret's tutelage, the gradual development of the beliefs that would eventually guide the family's actions. Nathaniel spoke articulately about how Margaret had taught them that there were deeper truths beyond what conventional society recognized. She spoke of ancient traditions, of knowledge preserved in secret through generations, of practices that could unlock normally dormant human potential. From a young age, Nathaniel and his siblings had been raised to see the world through this distorted lens, where common morality was simply the ignorance of the unenlightened. Price inquired about the ceremonies, about the perceived purpose of what the family was doing. Nathaniel explained with disturbing clarity that they believed they were conducting important work, exploring the frontiers of human experience and consciousness. The people held in the underground chambers were seen not as victims, but as necessary participants in something greater than any individual. In Nathaniel's mind, shaped since childhood, there was no crime because there was no true moral transgression. It was testimony calculated to demonstrate insanity, but it had the opposite effect on many of those present. Nathaniel's articulation, his ability to logically explain his actions, even when the premises were abominable, suggested not madness, but fundamental evil. It was possible, the jury seemed to be realizing, to be completely sane and yet monstrously immoral. Bradford recognized the opportunity Price had given him. In his cross-examination, he methodically guided Nathaniel through questions that revealed his awareness of the law, his understanding that society would consider his actions criminal, and the measures he had taken to conceal evidence and deceive authorities. Nathaniel answered honestly, without attempting to deny it, but each answer only reinforced that he knew exactly what he was doing and had chosen to do it anyway. Bradford inquired about specific victims, forcing Nathaniel to acknowledge that they were real people with families, lives, and dreams. Nathaniel admitted knowing this, but insisted that within the belief framework in which he operated, these considerations were secondary to the greater purpose. Bradford then asked the crucial question: if Nathaniel believed the law was wrong, why hide his actions? Why not act openly if he truly believed in the righteousness of his path? Nathaniel hesitated for the first time. It was a contradiction in his logical system, a crack in the facade of absolute conviction. He finally admitted that he knew society wouldn't understand, that there would be consequences. Bradford pressed, so Nathaniel acknowledged that he was violating social and legal norms, taking steps to avoid detection, and expecting negative consequences if discovered. How did this differ from any common criminal who simply chose to ignore the law for self-interest? The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Nathaniel struggled to respond. His composure finally cracked slightly, frustration showing on his face. He began to speak of how superior minds had always been persecuted by masses who did not understand, but his words sounded increasingly like empty rationalizations. By the time he stepped down from the podium, the damage was done. The jury had seen behind the mask of philosophical conviction and found simply a man who had chosen to place his desires above any consideration for the humanity of others. Price attempted to salvage the argument with the final testimony of Dr. Whitfield, who reiterated that genuine delusions could coexist with reasoning ability in other areas, and that the human mind was capable of extraordinary compartmentalization. But Bradford had planted enough doubt. The question was not whether the Crowes believed their distorted justifications, but whether those beliefs exempted them from legal responsibility for acts they knew to be crimes in the eyes of society. The closing statements took place in a silent and tense courtroom. Bradford spoke for nearly 2 hours, methodically reviewing all the evidence, connecting the dots, reminding the jury of the real victims whose lives had been destroyed. He argued that allowing an insanity plea in this case would set a dangerous precedent, where any sufficiently deviant belief system could be used as a shield against justice. Price did his best to defend his clients, appealing to the understanding that truly broken minds could not be judged by the same standards as sane minds. He painted a portrait of a family consumed by generational delusions, prisoners of an alternate reality, so complete that escape was impossible. But his words lacked the emotional force of the Bradford case, weighed down by the knowledge that he was defending the indefensible. Judge Blackburn instructed the jury carefully on the law, on the standards for legal insanity, on their duty to consider only evidence presented in court. He emphasized the gravity of their deliberations, how their decisions would affect not only the accused, but would set precedents for future justice. The jury retired as the afternoon darkened, snow still falling gently outside, isolating the courtroom from the rest of the world. The wait for the jury's deliberations stretched beyond what many had expected. Hours turned into a day, then 2. There was speculation that there was division among the jurors, that some might be persuaded by the insanity argument, while others maintained a firm conviction of complete guilt. Thatcher remained in Louisburg, unable to leave until the verdict was announced, feeling she owed it to the victims to stay until the very end. Meanwhile, on the Hollow Creek estate, now guarded and isolated, snow covered everything in immaculate whiteness, as if nature were trying to purify the place. But beneath that pristine surface, the subterranean chambers remained dark and empty, silent witnesses to horrors that could never be completely erased from the memory of that land. On the morning of the 3rd day of deliberations, a messenger emerged from the jury room. The verdict had been reached. The news spread through the city like wildfire, and within minutes crowds began to gather around the courthouse, thronging the snow-covered streets, waiting for a resolution they felt was necessary not only for the victims, but for the very soul of the community. The courtroom filled quickly, every seat occupied, people crowding the aisles and the back of the room. Judge Blackburn entered with a grave expression, and the silence that fell over the courtroom was so complete that one could hear the snow gently falling against the windows. The Crowe family was brought in. each member responding differently to the moment. Silas maintained his strangely dignified posture, as if he were above the entire procedure. Nathaniel observed with clinical interest, as if he were studying a phenomenon external to himself. Thomas and Samuel seemed catatonic, present only physically. Margaret remained in her trance, oblivious to everything. The jury spokesman, a middle-aged farmer named John Mercer, rose, his hands visibly trembling. Blackburn posed the formal question, and Mercer answered in a voice struggling to remain steady. Guilty on all counts. To every member of the Crowe family except Margaret, whom the jury deemed genuinely incapable of understanding or participating in her own defense due to her complete mental state. There was no explosion of emotion in the courtroom. Instead, a collective exhalation, as if everyone had been holding their breath for weeks and could finally release it. A few silent tears from victims' families, some satisfied nods, but mostly just a heavy, melancholic sense of closure. Justice had been done, but there was no triumph in it, only the grim recognition that some wounds never fully heal. Blackburn thanked the jury for their service and set the sentencing date for the following week. The Crowes were taken back to prison, and the courtroom slowly emptied, people emerging in the cold afternoon with expressions of relief mixed with exhaustion. Thatcher remained seated alone in the empty courtroom for a long time, gazing at the dais where so much pain had been recited, so many terrible truths revealed. The sentence, when finally pronounced, surprised few. Silas and Nathaniel received death by hanging, their executions scheduled for the following spring. Thomas and Samuel received life imprisonment with hard labor, taking into account their minor role and diminished mental capacity. Margaret was committed to an asylum for the insane, where she would spend the rest of her days lost in her impenetrable inner world. In the months following the trial, life in Louisburg and Greenbrier County gradually returned to some semblance of normalcy. Though it was a normalcy permanently marked by what had been revealed, the Hollow Creek property was confiscated by the state, and there were heated debates about what to do with it. Some argued that it should be destroyed completely, burned to the ground and the underground chambers sealed with explosives. Others believed it should be preserved as evidence, as a grim reminder of what could happen when humanity deviated so completely from its moral principles. In the end, a compromise was reached. The main house was dismantled, its timbers and stones scattered, the outer buildings were burned. But the underground chambers were simply sealed, their entrances blocked with stone and concrete, leaving them as silent tombs of the horrors that had occurred there. The land was sold at public auction, although no one local wanted to buy it. Eventually, a speculator from another state acquired it for a negligible price, but never developed the property, and it remained abandoned. The executions of Silas and Nathaniel took place on a rainy April morning. Crowds attended, but the event was conducted with somber dignity, not as a spectacle. Silas was hanged first, and his last words were an enigmatic statement about repeating cycles and knowledge that could not be destroyed. Nathaniel refused to speak, remaining silent until the end, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon as if he were seeing something beyond the reach of all others present. Margaret died less than a year later in the asylum, her body simply giving up, while her mind remained lost in whatever internal labyrinth she had constructed. The doctors who attended her reported that until her last breath, she continued murmuring in that strange language that no one ever managed to fully identify. Thomas and Samuel were transferred to a prison in the upstate, where they would spend decades in confinement before eventually perishing, broken men who had outlived their bodies. But it is Eliza, whose story remains the deepest and most disturbing mystery. Despite extensive searches that continued sporadically for years, she was never found. The cabin where evidence of her presence was discovered remained the last verifiable trace of her existence. Some people swore they had seen her in the mountains in subsequent years, a solitary figure wandering along remote trails, but these claims were never confirmed. There were stories, whispered in taverns and around firesides, of travelers who got lost deep in the mountains and found strange symbols carved into trees or rocks, symbols reminiscent of those Eliza had drawn. Other stories spoke of strange sounds echoing from deep caves on moonless nights, chants in unknown tongues that chilled the blood. These stories were usually dismissed as superstition or overactive imagination, but they persisted nonetheless, adding a layer of legend to the already documented horror of the Crowe family. Robert Thatcher remained sheriff for several more years, but the Crowe case fundamentally changed him. He became quieter, more contemplative, carrying with him the weight of the knowledge that beneath the surface of civilization lay currents of darkness that could emerge at any moment. He eventually retired and spent his final years writing a detailed account of the investigation, not for publication, but simply as a way to process what he had witnessed. The survivors rescued from the underground chambers followed diverse paths. Some managed to rebuild their lives, finding strength in community and mutual support. Others never fully recovered, haunted by memories they couldn't escape. Rebecca Hartley became a vocal advocate for improvements in the justice system, working to ensure that missing persons cases were taken more seriously by authorities. As the years passed and turned into decades, the Crowe family's story gradually took on the qualities of a local legend. New generations grew up hearing distorted and exaggerated versions of events, where facts were mixed with fiction, where real details were embellished or softened depending on the storyteller. The Hollow Creek estate became a place to be avoided, considered cursed by some, simply tragic by others. But for those who had lived through the events, for the victims' families, for the survivors and investigators, the story was never legend. It was living memory, real pain, a constant reminder of humanity's capacity for both evil and resilience in the face of it. The official trial records were preserved, meticulous documentation of crimes that defied easy comprehension but demanded recognition and remembrance. The story of the Crowe family remains to this day one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, a reminder that isolation and deviant beliefs can create pockets of horror even within civilized society. It is a story about how entire families can be consumed by destructive ideologies, about how authorities can fail to protect the vulnerable, about how communities must remain vigilant against those who operate in the shadows. But it is also a story about justice eventually prevailing, about survivors finding the courage to testify, about ordinary individuals like Robert Thatcher, who refuse to accept that crimes can remain hidden forever. It is a testament to the importance of listening when people disappear, of investigating when patterns emerge, of never assuming that what happens behind closed doors in remote places is beyond the reach of social responsibility. The Crowe family curse wasn't about supernatural forces or forbidden ancient knowledge. It was about the deliberate choice to abandon humanity, to treat other people as means to selfish ends, to build elaborate systems of suffering and justify them through empty philosophies. And the true lesson of the story is that such choices always leave traces, always create victims who eventually find a voice, always generate consequences, no matter how carefully they are hidden. Today, if you visit the area where Hollow Creek once stood, you'll find only forest reclaiming the land. The foundations of the houses have long since disappeared under vegetation. The sealed entrances to the subterranean chambers are covered by decades of soil and growth. But the story remains, preserved in archival documents, in eyewitness accounts, in the collective memory of a community that faced its darkest demons and survived. It is a story that was banned from history books not because of conspiracy, but because of collective shame, a desire to forget, and horror at what it revealed about humanity's potential for cruelty. But stories like this should not be forgotten. They must be remembered, studied, understood, so that we can recognize warning signs when they emerge again, so that we can better protect the vulnerable, so that we can build societies where such horrors become increasingly impossible. If this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history has impacted you, subscribe to the channel for more dark and mysterious stories that have been forgotten by time but deserve to be told. Leave your thoughts in the comments on how societies can prevent such tragedies from occurring, and share so that others can learn from these dark events of the past.